I'm Holly, and I'm 21 years old. 3 days ago, I buried the only person who ever truly loved me, and today I'm sitting in a lawyer's office staring at the two people who abandoned me 8 years ago. My parents had the audacity to show up for Uncle Richard's will reading after vanishing from my life when I was just 13. They're sitting across from me now, whispering to each other like they have some kind of plan. The moment I walked into this mahogany-paneled office, I knew something was wrong. Dad looked older, grayer around the temples, wearing a suit that had seen better days. Mom sat beside him in a cheap dress, her wedding ring from her second marriage catching the fluorescent light. Neither of them had bothered to attend the funeral, but here they were, ready to claim whatever they thought they deserved. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below and hit that like and subscribe button if you've ever felt completely betrayed by the people who were supposed to protect you. You'll definitely want to stick around for what happened next. Let me take you back to where this all started. When I was 13, my world completely fell apart in the span of 2 weeks. Dad packed his bags on a Tuesday morning, mumbling something about needing space and finding himself. He kissed my forehead, promised he'd call, and drove away in his beat-up Honda. That was the last time I saw him until today. Mom handled the divorce about as well as you'd expect. Instead of leaning on me for support or trying to keep our little family together, she immediately started dating. Tony appeared in our lives exactly 3 weeks after Dad left, like he'd been waiting in the wings. Suddenly, Mom was never home. She'd leave for work in the morning and come back late at night, if at all. I remember the first time she didn't come home for 2 straight days. I was 14, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, when I realized I hadn't seen her since Monday. It was Wednesday night. The refrigerator was empty except for some moldy cheese and expired milk. I'd been living on peanut butter sandwiches and whatever I could scrounge from the pantry. That's when I knew I was completely on my own. At 14, I was washing my own clothes, cooking my own meals, and getting myself to school every day. Mom would breeze through occasionally, usually to grab fresh clothes or ask if I'd seen her phone charger. She looked right through me like I was furniture. The breaking point came when I was 15. Mom disappeared for 4 entire days without a word. I had no money for groceries, no way to reach her, and I was scared. That's when I swallowed my pride and walked the 12 blocks to Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena's house, carrying everything I owned in a backpack. Uncle Richard opened the door, took one look at my face, and immediately knew something was terribly wrong. "Where's your mother, sweetheart?" he asked, pulling me inside where Aunt Helena was waiting with worried eyes and open arms. But that conversation would change everything in ways I never could have imagined. Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena didn't just take me in that night, they went straight to Mom's workplace the next morning to find out what had happened. What they discovered made me realize just how little I meant to my own mother. Turns out, Mom had taken vacation days to go on a romantic getaway with Tony. She'd left me alone for 4 days without telling a single soul where she was going or when she'd be back. When Uncle Richard confronted her supervisor, the woman looked genuinely shocked that a 15-year-old had been left home alone. She never mentioned having a daughter, the supervisor said, according to Uncle Richard. That sentence hit me harder than anything that had happened during the divorce. When Mom finally returned 10 days later, tanned and relaxed from her Caribbean vacation, she found me sitting at Uncle Richard's kitchen table doing homework. She didn't apologize. She didn't even seem surprised. Instead, she sat down across from me and delivered news that would seal my fate forever. "Tony proposed," she announced, like she was sharing the most wonderful news in the world. "We're getting married next month, and I'm moving into his place." She paused, examining her new engagement ring. "But Tony already has his hands full with his own kids visiting on weekends. There's really no room for you." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline or some sign that she was kidding. When neither came, I felt something inside me break completely. "You have 2 choices," she continued matter-of-factly. "You can stay here with Richard and Helena, or you can try to find your father. I honestly don't care which you choose." Uncle Richard, who had been standing in the doorway listening, stepped forward. His face was pale with rage, but his voice remained calm. "Susan, she's your daughter." "And she's 15, Mom replied, standing up and smoothing her skirt. "Almost an adult. She'll be fine." That was it. No custody discussion, no legal arrangements, no emotional goodbye. She kissed my forehead the same way Dad had, promised she'd keep in touch, and walked out of my life. 3 weeks later, I learned from a neighbor that she'd gotten married in a small ceremony at the courthouse. I wasn't invited to my own mother's wedding. Uncle Richard tried reaching out to Dad, hoping to establish some kind of official guardianship arrangement. But Dad had apparently left the country for work and wasn't responding to any attempts at contact. So Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena did what came naturally to them. They welcomed me into their family without hesitation. The difference in my life was immediate and overwhelming. Instead of the cramped apartment where I'd been raising myself, I now lived in their beautiful two-story house with a garden that Aunt Helena tended lovingly. Instead of eating peanut butter sandwiches for dinner, I sat down to home-cooked meals where adults actually asked about my day and listened to my answers. They enrolled me in Westfield Academy, a private school where the other kids carried designer backpacks and talked about family vacations to Europe. At first, I felt completely out of place, but Uncle Richard hired tutors to help me catch up academically, and Aunt Helena made sure I had everything I needed to fit in socially. For the first time in years, I had adults who showed up to parent-teacher conferences, who helped with homework, who remembered my birthday and made it special. Uncle Richard taught me to drive in their Mercedes, patiently letting me practice in empty parking lots until I was confident. Aunt Helena took me shopping for clothes that actually fit and weren't from discount stores. But the most important thing they gave me was something I'd been missing since I was 13, the feeling that I mattered to someone. The transformation wasn't just external. For years, I'd been angry, defensive, and constantly on guard. Under their care, I slowly began to relax and trust again. I made friends at Westfield, joined the debate team, and started planning for college things that had seemed impossible when I was just trying to survive day by day. Still, late at night, I sometimes wondered if Mom ever thought about me. 3 years into my new life, just as I was starting to believe that good things could last, tragedy struck our family. Aunt Helena, who had been my safe harbor through everything, was diagnosed with aggressive ovarian cancer at age 52. The diagnosis came on a random Tuesday in October. Aunt Helena had been experiencing fatigue and stomach pain for months, but she'd attributed it to stress from her job at the local museum. When she finally went to the doctor, the news was devastating. Stage 3 cancer already spread to her lymph nodes. Uncle Richard aged 10 years in the span of that doctor's appointment. I watched this strong, successful man crumble as he tried to process the possibility of losing his wife. But Aunt Helena, true to form, approached her illness with the same grace and determination she brought to everything else. "We're going to fight this," she announced to Uncle Richard and me over dinner that night. "And we're going to make every day count, regardless of what happens." For the next 8 months, our house became a fortress of hope and determination. Uncle Richard rearranged his entire work schedule to drive Aunt Helena to chemotherapy appointments. I took a part-time job after school to help with household expenses, though Uncle Richard insisted it wasn't necessary. We all threw ourselves into supporting Aunt Helena through her treatment. The chemo was brutal. There were days when Aunt Helena couldn't keep food down, when she was too weak to get out of bed, when the normally vibrant woman who had saved my life became a shadow of herself. But she never complained, and she never stopped making sure I felt loved and supported. "Promise me something," she said to me one evening as I sat beside her bed, helping her sip ginger tea. Her hair was gone by then, and she wore a soft pink scarf that Uncle Richard had bought her. "Promise me you'll never settle for less than you deserve. Promise me you'll remember that you're worthy of love and respect, no matter what anyone else tries to tell you." I promised, not realizing at the time that she was preparing me for what was coming. Aunt Helena passed away on a Sunday morning in June, 2 weeks after my 18th birthday. She died peacefully in her sleep, holding Uncle Richard's hand. I found them both that way when I brought breakfast upstairs, Uncle Richard sitting beside the bed, still holding her hand, tears streaming down his face. The funeral was beautiful but heartbreaking. Aunt Helena had planned every detail herself, wanting to spare us the burden of making decisions while grieving. The church was filled with white roses, her favorite flower, and her colleagues from the museum shared stories about her kindness and dedication. But losing Aunt Helena changed Uncle Richard in ways that worried me deeply. The man who had been my rock, who had given me stability and love when my own parents couldn't be bothered, began to withdraw. He stopped eating regularly, lost interest in his business, and spent hours sitting in the garden that Aunt Helena had loved so much. I tried everything I could think of to help him through his grief. I cooked his favorite meals, even though he barely touched them. I sat with him in the evenings, trying to make conversation about anything that might bring him back to the present. I even suggested grief counseling, but he refused to consider it. "I just need time," he would say whenever I expressed concern. "I'll be fine, sweetheart. Don't worry about me." But I could see that he wasn't fine. Uncle Richard was slowly disappearing right in front of me, and I felt powerless to stop it. Have you ever experienced losing someone who was like a parent to you? Drop a comment below and let me know how you got through it. As my senior year at Westfield Academy progressed, I threw myself into my studies and college applications, partly as a distraction from my worry about Uncle Richard. I'd been accepted to several good universities, and Uncle Richard insisted on paying for my education despite his depression. "Helena would want you to have every opportunity," he said when I tried to argue about the expense. "This is what we planned for, what we saved for. Don't let her sacrifice be for nothing." So I prepared for college while watching the only father figure I'd ever known slowly fade away. I had no idea that I was about to lose him too. College was supposed to be my fresh start, but I spent most of my freshman year worried sick about Uncle Richard. Even though I was only an hour away at Boston University studying business administration, I came home every weekend to check on him. The house felt different without Aunt Helena's warm presence. Uncle Richard had let the garden grow wild, and dust gathered on surfaces that she used to keep spotless. He'd lost weight and often forgot to shave. His successful accounting firm was suffering because he could barely focus on work. I tried everything to bring him back to life. I organized photo albums of his happy memories with Aunt Helena. I cooked elaborate dinners, hoping food might spark some interest. I even convinced him to adopt a golden retriever puppy, thinking the responsibility might give him purpose. Nothing worked. "I'm just tired, Holly," he would say when I pressed him about seeing a doctor or therapist. "Some days it feels like too much effort just to breathe without her." My grades at BU started slipping because I was constantly distracted. My roommate, Sarah, finally sat me down and pointed out what I couldn't see myself. "You can't save him from grief," she said gently. "You can love him and support him, but you can't fix this for him." Sarah was right, but that didn't make it easier to watch. Uncle Richard had saved my life when I was 15, and I desperately wanted to return the favor. I felt guilty for being away at school while he was suffering alone. During spring break of my sophomore year, I made a decision that would define the next phase of my life. Instead of going to Florida with friends, I moved back home to take care of Uncle Richard full-time. I transferred to a local community college where I could continue my business courses while being present for him. Uncle Richard protested, of course. "Helena and I didn't sacrifice everything so you could throw away your education to babysit me," he argued. But I was stubborn, and ultimately, I think he was relieved to have company in that empty house. Taking care of Uncle Richard became my full-time job, even though he didn't need physical assistance. He needed someone to make sure he ate, to remind him to take his blood pressure medication, to sit with him during the long evenings when grief hit hardest. I became his anchor to the world of the living. Slowly, gradually, my presence began to help. Uncle Richard started showering regularly again and taking an interest in his appearance. He began joining me for dinner instead of picking at food alone in the kitchen. We developed evening routines where we'd watch old movies or work on crossword puzzles together. By my junior year at community college, Uncle Richard seemed to be stabilizing. He even returned to work part-time, taking on a few select clients who had waited patiently for him to recover. I was cautiously optimistic that we'd turned a corner. "You know, I think Helena would be proud of the woman you've become," he told me one evening as we sat in the garden, now restored to some of its former beauty. "You didn't have to sacrifice your dreams to take care of me, but you did it anyway. That's the kind of person she raised you to be." And I was finally starting to believe that maybe, just maybe, we could build a new kind of happiness together. Uncle Richard and I had become more than uncle and niece. We were family in the truest sense, survivors who had found strength in each other. I should have known that kind of peace was too good to last. The heart attack came without warning on a Tuesday evening in March, just 3 weeks after my 21st birthday. Uncle Richard had seemed fine that morning, even cheerful as he made coffee and read the newspaper. He'd spent the day working in his home office, taking calls from clients, handling paperwork. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when I heard a crash from the living room. I found Uncle Richard collapsed beside his favorite armchair, his face gray and twisted in pain. He was conscious but couldn't speak, clutching his chest with one hand. The paramedics arrived within minutes of my call, but I could see in their faces that it was too late. Uncle Richard held my hand in the ambulance, his eyes telling me everything he couldn't say out loud. He died at the hospital 2 hours later, surrounded by doctors who had done everything they could. Just like that, I was alone again. The days immediately following Uncle Richard's death passed in a blur of funeral arrangements, legal paperwork, and sympathetic casseroles from neighbors I barely knew. I moved through the motions like a robot, making decisions about flowers and music while feeling completely numb inside. The funeral was smaller than Aunt Helena's had been. Uncle Richard had lived a quieter life in his grief, and many of his old friends had drifted away over the past 3 years. But his business colleagues came to pay their respects, and several of Aunt Helena's former co-workers attended to honor the man who had loved her so completely. I stood at the graveside watching them lower Uncle Richard's casket into the ground beside Aunt Helena's and felt utterly alone in the world. At 21, I was an orphan in every way that mattered. My biological parents were somewhere out there living their own lives, but they had made it clear 8 years ago that I wasn't part of their plans. The most surreal part was receiving condolence cards from distant relatives I hadn't seen since childhood. Cousins I barely remembered sent generic sympathy cards with messages like, "Sorry for your loss," and "He's in a better place now." None of them offered to help with arrangements or asked if I needed anything. They were just checking a social obligation off their list. What struck me most during those difficult days was the complete absence of my parents. Uncle Richard's death had been announced in the local newspaper, the same paper my parents had grown up reading, but neither of them called, sent flowers, or acknowledged in any way that the man who had raised their daughter had died. Their silence spoke volumes about the kind of people they had become. 3 days after the funeral, I received a call that would change everything. Mr. Brennan, Uncle Richard's attorney, asked me to come to his office for the reading of the will. I assumed it would be a formality. Maybe Uncle Richard had left me a small inheritance or some personal items to remember him by. "Will anyone else be attending?" I asked Mr. Brennan over the phone. "Yes," he replied, his tone oddly formal. "Your father contacted my office yesterday. He'll be present for the reading." My heart nearly stopped. Dad was coming? After 8 years of complete silence, he was suddenly interested in Uncle Richard's affairs? Something about this felt wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on what exactly. "What about my mother?" I asked, though I already suspected the answer. "She'll be there as well," Mr. Brennan confirmed. "The reading is scheduled for Friday at 2 p.m. I spent the next 2 days in a state of anxiety unlike anything I'd experienced since those early days of abandonment. Why were they coming now? What did they think they were entitled to? And most importantly, how was I going to handle seeing them face to face after all these years? Part of me was curious about what they looked like now, whether they'd changed, if they'd ever regretted their choices. But a bigger part of me was terrified that seeing them would bring back all the pain and insecurity I'd worked so hard to overcome. Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena had rebuilt my self-worth from the ground up. They'd taught me that I was valuable, lovable, worthy of care and attention. But old wounds have a way of reopening when you least expect it, and I was afraid that my parents' presence would undo years of healing. I considered not going to the reading at all. Legally, I didn't have to be there. Mr. Brennan could contact me afterward with any relevant information, but something inside me, maybe curiosity, maybe a need for closure, insisted that I face whatever was coming. On Friday morning, I dressed carefully in the navy blue suit Aunt Helena had helped me pick out for college interviews. She'd always said that how you present yourself tells the world how you expect to be treated. I needed all the confidence I could muster for what lay ahead. As I drove to Mr. Brennan's office, my hands shaking slightly on the steering wheel, I had no idea that I was about to witness the true character of the people who had given me life, but never really been my parents. The moment of truth was finally here. Walking into Mr. Brennan's office felt like stepping into a nightmare I'd thought I'd escaped years ago. There they were, sitting side by side on the leather couch across from Mr. Brennan's desk, my mother and father, together for the first time since their divorce 8 years earlier. Dad looked older, grayer, with deep lines around his eyes that hadn't been there when he left. He wore a suit that had seen better days, and his shoes needed polishing. Mom sat rigidly beside him, wearing what was obviously her best dress but still managing to look somehow cheap. Her wedding ring from Tony caught the light, and I noticed she'd gained weight over the years. Neither of them stood when I entered. Neither of them hugged me or offered condolences for my loss. They barely looked at me at all, instead focusing their attention on Mr. Brennan as if I weren't even in the room. "Now that everyone's here," Mr. Brennan began, adjusting his glasses and opening a thick folder, "we can proceed with the reading of Richard Montgomery's last will and testament." I took a seat in the chair opposite my parents, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure everyone could hear it. The last time I'd been in the same room with both of them was probably my 14th birthday, right before Dad left. Now here we were, reunited by death and apparently money. Mr. Brennan cleared his throat and began reading the formal language of the will. Uncle Richard had been thorough and specific, leaving detailed instructions for his funeral arrangements, charitable donations, and the distribution of his personal effects. But the bulk of the document dealt with his substantial estate. "To my beloved niece, Holly Montgomery, who brought light back into my life during my darkest hours, I leave the entirety of my estate," Mr. Brennan read. "This includes all properties, investments, business assets, and personal belongings. Holly has been the daughter Helena and I never had, and she deserves every opportunity to build the life she chooses." The silence that followed was deafening. I sat there in shock, trying to process what I'd just heard. Uncle Richard had left me everything: his house, his successful accounting firm, his investment portfolio. I'd expected maybe a small inheritance or some keepsakes, not his entire life's work. Dad was the first to break the silence. And when he did, he revealed exactly why he'd bothered to show up after 8 years of absence. "That's impossible," he said, his voice rising. "I'm his blood relative. I'm his brother. There must be some mistake." Mr. Brennan calmly removed his glasses and fixed Dad with a steady stare. "There's no mistake, Mr. Montgomery. The will is quite clear and legally binding." Richard was very specific about his intentions. "But she's just a child," Mom interjected, speaking as if I weren't sitting right there. "She can't possibly manage that kind of responsibility. We're her parents, we should oversee her inheritance until she's mature enough to handle it properly. I found my voice for the first time since entering the office. I'm 21 years old, I said quietly. I'm not a child. Mom looked at me then, really looked at me, for the first time in 8 years. I saw her take in my appearance, the expensive suit, the confident posture, the education and polish that Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena had given me. For just a moment, I thought I saw something that might have been regret flicker across her face, but it was quickly replaced by calculation. Holly, sweetheart, she said, her tone suddenly saccharine, you have to understand that this is a lot of money and responsibility. Your father and I only want what's best for you. We could help you manage everything. Make sure you don't make any costly mistakes. The audacity was breathtaking. After abandoning me completely, after refusing to even attend Uncle Richard's funeral, they had the nerve to suggest that they should control my inheritance. But what happened next would show me exactly what kind of people my parents had become. Dad stood up abruptly, his face flushed with anger and desperation. This is ridiculous, he announced to the room. I'm going to contest this will. Richard wasn't thinking clearly after Helena died. Everyone knows he was depressed. He was obviously manipulated into this decision. His words hung in the air like an accusation, and I felt something cold settle in my chest. He was actually suggesting that I had somehow tricked Uncle Richard into leaving me his estate. The man who had fed me, housed me, educated me, and loved me unconditionally was being portrayed as a victim of my manipulation. Furthermore, Dad continued, warming to his theme, as Richard's only living brother, I have legal standing to challenge this will. Holly's not even a Montgomery by blood, she's Richard's niece through marriage, not a direct descendant. Mr. Brennan's expression grew stern. Mr. Montgomery, I need to stop you right there. First, Richard was absolutely of sound mind when he drafted this will. I have medical documentation to that effect. Second, Holly has been legally part of Richard's household for 8 years. He considered her his daughter in every way that matters. But Dad wasn't finished. He turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, pure resentment mixed with entitlement. You know, Holly, if you had any decency, you'd recognize that this money rightfully belongs to family, real family. That's when something inside me snapped. The frightened 15-year-old who had begged for scraps of attention from these people was gone, replaced by a young woman who had learned her worth through 8 years of genuine love and support. I stood up slowly, meeting Dad's glare with steady eyes. You're right, I said calmly. This inheritance should go to Richard's real family, the people who loved him, supported him, and stood by him when he needed them most. Dad's face brightened, thinking he'd won. That would be me, I continued. The girl who held his hand through his wife's death, who moved home from college to take care of him, who made sure he ate and took his medication and didn't give up on life completely. Where were you during those 3 years, Dad? Where were either of you? Mom shifted uncomfortably in her seat, but Dad doubled down on his attack. You don't understand the complexity of adult relationships, Holly. There were reasons we couldn't— Stop, I interrupted, my voice growing stronger. Just stop. You abandoned me when I was 13 years old. You chose new lives that didn't include me, and now you want to waltz back in because there's money involved? I turned to address them both, 8 years of suppressed hurt and anger finally finding their voice. You didn't come to Uncle Richard's funeral. You didn't send flowers or a card. You didn't even call to see if I was okay after losing the only parent figures I've had since you both decided I was disposable. The truth was finally out in the open, raw and painful, and impossible to deny. Mom tried a different approach, her voice becoming pleading. Holly, we made mistakes. We were young and selfish, and we handled the divorce badly. But we're your parents. We love you, and we want to be part of your life now. Now, I repeated, letting the words sink in. You want to be part of my life now, when there's something in it for you. Mr. Brennan cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable with the family drama unfolding in his office. Perhaps we should continue this discussion at another time. The will reading is complete, and— No, I said firmly. We're going to finish this right here, right now. What do you think will happen next? Drop your predictions in the comments below. I looked at my parents, really looked at them, and saw strangers who shared my DNA but had never been my family in any meaningful way. You want to contest the will? I asked Dad. Go ahead. Waste your money on legal fees fighting a document that clearly states Uncle Richard's wishes. But understand this, even if you somehow succeeded, which you won't, I would never share a penny with either of you. The room fell silent, except for the ticking of Mr. Brennan's antique clock. You taught me an important lesson when I was 13, I continued. You taught me that people will disappoint you, that you can't count on anyone, and that love is conditional. Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena spent 8 years teaching me the opposite. They showed me what real family looks like, and it has nothing to do with shared blood. I picked up my purse and headed for the door, but turned back one final time. "Don't contact me again," I said. "Don't call. Don't write. Don't show up at my house. You made your choice 8 years ago, and I'm making mine now." As I walked out of that office, leaving my biological parents behind forever, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: complete and total freedom. The next few weeks passed in a whirlwind of legal meetings, financial consultations, and paperwork that seemed to multiply exponentially. Uncle Richard's estate was far more substantial than I'd realized, not just the beautiful house I'd called home for 8 years, but also a thriving accounting firm, multiple investment properties, and a stock portfolio that made my head spin. Mr. Brennan had been Uncle Richard's attorney for over 20 years, and he guided me through the process with patience and professionalism. "Your uncle was very shrewd with his investments," he explained during one of our meetings. "He and Helena lived modestly compared to their actual wealth. They were always planning for your future." That revelation hit me harder than the money itself. Even during those dark years after Aunt Helena's death, when Uncle Richard could barely function day to day, he had been thinking about my security and future. The weight of that responsibility felt enormous. True to his word, Dad filed a legal challenge to the will within a week of the reading. Mr. Brennan had expected this and assured me that the case had no merit, but the stress of ongoing litigation was exhausting. Every few days brought new court documents, depositions, or meetings with lawyers. The most difficult part was seeing how desperate my parents had become. Through the legal discovery process, I learned that Dad had accumulated significant debt over the past 8 years and had been jumping from job to job. Mom's marriage to Tony had ended badly, leaving her with credit card debt and few prospects. They weren't just greedy. They were drowning financially and saw my inheritance as their life preserver. "They're claiming emotional distress," Mr. Brennan informed me during one particularly frustrating meeting. "They're saying that Richard's decision to cut them out of the will caused psychological harm and damaged their relationship with you." I almost laughed at the absurdity. "What relationship?" I asked. "They didn't have a relationship with me before the will reading. They chose to abandon that relationship when I was 13. But the legal proceedings dragged on for months, casting a shadow over what should have been a time of new beginnings. I couldn't fully move forward with my life while this lawsuit hung over my head. I couldn't sell Uncle Richard's house, couldn't make major changes to the business, couldn't even plan my future without wondering if it might all be taken away. The stress began affecting my health. I lost weight, had trouble sleeping, and found myself constantly on edge. The confident young woman who had faced down her parents in Mr. Brennan's office was slowly being worn down by the grinding machinery of the legal system. My saving grace was Dr. Sarah Chen, a therapist Mr. Brennan recommended who specialized in family trauma. "You're not just dealing with a legal challenge," she explained during our first session. "You're processing years of abandonment and the fresh grief of losing your uncle. That's a lot for anyone to handle." Dr. Chen helped me understand that my parents' lawsuit wasn't really about money. It was about control and their inability to accept responsibility for their choices. "People who abandon their children often create narratives that justify their behavior," she said. "Admitting that you succeeded without them, that you're better off without them, threatens that narrative." Slowly, with Dr. Chen's help, I began to reclaim my sense of agency. Instead of feeling like a victim of my parents' greed, I started seeing their lawsuit as confirmation that I'd made the right choice in cutting them out of my life. The breakthrough came during a deposition where Dad's lawyer tried to paint me as a manipulative gold digger who had isolated Uncle Richard from his family. Under oath, I calmly recounted the 8 years I'd lived with Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena, the family dinners, the college applications they'd helped me with, the way they'd supported me through every milestone. "Where was my father during my high school graduation?" I asked the lawyer. "Where was he when I got accepted to Boston University? Where was he when Aunt Helena was dying of cancer?" The lawyer had no answers because there were no answers. Dad had chosen to be absent for every important moment of my life. By the time the deposition was over, even Dad's lawyer looked uncomfortable. You can't fabricate 8 years of abandonment, and you can't argue that loving, involved parents should have priority over the people who actually raised a child. 2 weeks later, Mr. Brennan called with the news I'd been waiting for. Dad had dropped the lawsuit, but the victory felt hollow because I realized that no legal ruling could undo the fundamental truth of my situation. With the lawsuit finally behind me, I could focus on building the life Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena had dreamed for me. But first, I had to figure out what that life should look like. At 21, I was suddenly wealthy beyond my wildest imagination, but I'd never had the luxury of dreaming big. The first major decision was what to do with Uncle Richard's accounting firm. He'd built it from nothing into a successful practice with 12 employees and over 200 clients. Several of his key staff members approached me about buying the business, and while the offers were generous, I surprised myself by deciding to keep it. "I want to learn the business," I told Margaret, Uncle Richard's longtime office manager. Not just the financial side, but how he built something that meant so much to people. Margaret, a 60-something woman who had worked with Uncle Richard for 15 years, became my mentor. She taught me about client relationships, business operations, and the careful attention to detail that had made Uncle Richard's firm so successful. "Your uncle had a gift for making people feel heard," Margaret explained as we reviewed client files together. "These aren't just numbers on a page, they're real people's livelihoods, their children's college funds, their retirement dreams." I threw myself into learning every aspect of the business with the same intensity I'd once applied to taking care of Uncle Richard. I completed my business degree through night classes while working at the firm during the day. I studied for my accounting certification and passed on the first try. But the most meaningful part of running Uncle Richard's business was connecting with his clients. These were people who had trusted him with their financial futures for decades, and many of them shared stories about how he'd helped them through difficult times. "When my husband died," one elderly client told me, "Richard spent 3 hours on a Saturday walking me through my finances and helping me understand what I needed to do. He never charged me for that time. He said that's what family does." Stories like these helped me understand the legacy Uncle Richard had left me, not just money, but a responsibility to carry forward his values of service and compassion. As the business stabilized under my leadership, I began making plans for my personal life. The house where I'd lived with Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena held too many memories, both wonderful and painful. I decided to sell it and buy a smaller place closer to downtown, somewhere I could build my own memories. The day I moved out of that house was one of the hardest of my life. Every room held echoes of the family I'd found and lost. Aunt Helena's garden, which I'd tried to maintain after her death, bloomed with roses she'd planted years earlier. Uncle Richard's study still smelled faintly of the pipe tobacco he'd enjoyed on rare occasions. But as I packed their belongings, carefully preserving photo albums, Aunt Helena's jewelry, Uncle Richard's books, I realized I wasn't really leaving them behind. The lessons they'd taught me, the love they'd shown me, the confidence they'd instilled in me, all of that would go with me wherever I went. My new house was a modest 2-bedroom cottage in a quiet neighborhood near the university. It had good light, hardwood floors, and a small garden where I could plant my own roses. For the first time in my life, I was creating a space that was entirely mine. The independence was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. I'd gone from being abandoned at 13 to being cared for by Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena, and now I was truly on my own. But it was a different kind of alone than I'd experienced as a teenager. This was chosen solitude, backed by financial security and emotional strength. I began dating occasionally, though I was cautious about relationships. Dr. Chen had helped me recognize that my childhood experiences had left me with trust issues, and I was determined not to let those issues control my romantic life. "You have the right to be selective," she reminded me during one of our sessions. "You've learned what real love and support look like. Don't settle for less than that in a partner." As I approached my 22nd birthday, my second without Uncle Richard, I reflected on how much my life had changed. A year earlier, I'd been a grief-stricken college student caring for a depressed uncle. Now I was a successful business owner with a beautiful home and a future full of possibilities. But I still carried the scars of abandonment, and I wondered if I'd ever fully trust that good things in my life would last. That's when fate decided to test my newfound strength in a way I never could have anticipated. The call came on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly reports at the office. Margaret knocked on my door with an expression I'd learned to recognize she had news that was going to complicate my day. "Holly, there's a woman on line 2 who says she's your mother," Margaret said carefully. "She's quite insistent about speaking with you." My blood went cold. I hadn't heard from either of my parents in over a year, not since Dad dropped his lawsuit. I'd assumed they'd finally accepted that I was permanently out of their lives. "Did she say what she wanted?" I asked, already knowing the answer wouldn't be anything I wanted to hear. "She mentioned something about a family emergency," Margaret replied. "Should I tell her you're unavailable?" I stared at the blinking light on my phone, weighing my options. Part of me wanted to hang up immediately. I'd made it clear that I didn't want contact with them, but curiosity won out, along with a nagging worry that something might have genuinely happened to one of them. "I'll take it," I said, picking up the phone with reluctance. "This is Holly." "Oh, sweetheart," Mom's voice came through the line with artificial brightness. "I'm so glad you took my call. I wasn't sure you would after everything that happened." I waited in silence, not willing to make this conversation easier for her. "Listen, I know you asked us not to contact you," she continued, "but this is important. It's about your father." My stomach clenched. "What about him?" He's been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. The doctors say he has maybe 6 months left. The news hit me like a physical blow, even though I'd cut Dad out of my life. Hearing that someone is dying, even someone who hurt you deeply, creates a complicated mix of emotions that's impossible to prepare for. I'm sorry to hear that, I said carefully, but I'm not sure why you're telling me this. Holly, he wants to see you, Mom said, her voice becoming pleading. He knows he made mistakes and he wants to apologize before it's too late. He's been asking about you constantly since the diagnosis. I closed my eyes, feeling the familiar manipulation tactics that had controlled so much of my childhood. The timing was suspiciously convenient. Dad develops a terminal illness just as his legal challenge to Uncle Richard's will had failed completely. Where is he? I asked, surprised by my own question. He's at St. Mary's Hospital, room 314, Mom said quickly, sensing an opening. He's been there for 2 weeks now. The cancer has spread to his liver and his bones. He's not the man you remember, Holly. That last part was probably true, but not in the way she meant it. The man I remembered had been weak, selfish, and willing to abandon his 13-year-old daughter without a backward glance. I doubted terminal cancer had fundamentally changed his character. I'll think about it, I said finally. Please don't wait too long, Mom pressed. The doctors say his condition is deteriorating rapidly. After I hung up, I sat in my office trying to process what I'd just learned. My father was dying, and part of me felt like I should care more than I did. But the truth was, I'd already grieved the loss of my father years ago. The man dying in that hospital bed was a stranger who happened to share my DNA. I called Dr. Chen and scheduled an emergency session for that evening. How do you feel about your father's diagnosis? She asked, after I'd recounted the conversation with Mom. Confused, I admitted. I feel like I should be sadder than I am. I feel like maybe I should go see him, but I also feel like it might be a trap. What kind of trap? I thought about that for a moment. I think they're hoping that his illness will make me feel guilty enough to let them back into my life. Mom mentioned that he wants to apologize, but they've had 8 years to apologize. Why now? Dr. Chen nodded thoughtfully. People facing death often experience genuine regret, but they also sometimes use their mortality as leverage to get what they want from others. Only you can decide whether you believe your father's desire to see you is genuine. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, thinking about the father I'd once known. Before the divorce, before the abandonment, he'd been a different person. He taught me to ride a bike, helped me with science fair projects, read bedtime stories when I was small, but those memories felt like they belonged to someone else's life. The question wasn't whether the dying man in room 314 deserved my forgiveness. The question was whether I needed to offer it for my own peace of mind. By morning, I'd made my decision. I drove to St. Mary's Hospital the next afternoon, my hands shaking slightly as I parked in the visitor's lot. I'd chosen to come alone, despite Dr. Chen's suggestion that I might want moral support. This conversation, whatever it turned out to be, needed to happen without witnesses. Room 314 was at the end of a long corridor that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Through the partially open door, I could see a figure lying in the hospital bed, connected to various machines that beeped softly in the background. The man in that bed looked nothing like the father I remembered. Dad had always been tall and broad-shouldered, the kind of man who filled a room with his presence. The person I saw now was gaunt and gray, his skin hanging loose on his bones. His hair, what little remained, was completely white. Cancer had reduced him to a shadow of his former self. I knocked softly on the doorframe. Dad? His eyes opened slowly, and when he saw me, his face transformed with an expression of pure relief and gratitude. Holly, he whispered, his voice rough and barely audible. You came. I stepped into the room but remained near the door, keeping my emotional distance even as I closed the physical gap between us. Mom said you wanted to see me. Sit down, please, he said, gesturing weakly toward the chair beside his bed. I have so much I need to say to you. I remained standing. I'm listening. Dad struggled to sit up straighter, wincing with pain from the effort. I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, he began, but I need you to know how sorry I am for what I did to you, for what we both did. The apology I'd waited 8 years to hear was finally coming, but it felt hollow now. Too little. Too late. I was a coward, he continued, his voice gaining strength as he spoke. When your mother and I divorced, I was so angry and hurt that I couldn't think straight. I convinced myself that you were better off without me, that starting fresh meant leaving everything behind. Including your daughter, I said quietly. Including my daughter, he admitted, tears beginning to form in his eyes. The biggest mistake of my life. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving manipulation. What I saw instead was genuine anguish, The regret of a man who'd realized too late the magnitude of his failures. Do you know what the hardest part was? I asked, my own voice becoming emotional despite my efforts to stay detached. It wasn't that you left. It was that you never looked back. Never called. Never wrote. Never showed any interest in whether I was alive or dead. Dad closed his eyes, unable to meet my gaze. I told myself you were angry and didn't want to hear from me. I told myself that Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena could give you things I couldn't. I made 1,000 excuses because facing the truth was too painful. What truth? That I abandoned my daughter because I was too weak to handle my own problems, he said, opening his eyes to look directly at me. That I chose the easy path instead of fighting for you. The admission hung between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I wanted to cross. Your mother feels the same way, he continued. She's been waiting in the family room every day since I called you, hoping you'd agree to see her too. That revelation surprised me. Mom was here? She'd been coming to the hospital daily, waiting for a chance to see me? She's as broken as I am about what we did, Dad said. We both know we lost the most important thing in our lives, and we know it's our own fault. I felt my carefully constructed emotional walls beginning to crack. For 8 years, I'd carried the anger and hurt of their abandonment. I'd built my entire identity around being strong enough to survive without them. But seeing my father dying, hearing him take full responsibility for his choices, was undermining my narrative about who the villains were in my story. I don't know how to forgive you, I said honestly. I don't know if I can. I'm not asking for forgiveness, Dad replied. I know I don't deserve it. I don't. I just needed you to know that leaving you was the worst thing I've ever done, and not a day goes by that I don't regret it. He reached for something on his bedside table, a worn photograph that I recognized immediately. It was a picture of us from my 10th birthday, both of us grinning at the camera as I blew out candles on a homemade cake. I've carried this with me everywhere I went, he said, holding up the photo with trembling hands. It's the only thing that made me feel human during these past 8 years. The sight of that photograph evidenced that I'd mattered to him even when he'd acted like I didn't finally broke through my defenses. Tears I'd been holding back for years began to flow. I needed you, I whispered. When Aunt Helena died, when Uncle Richard was falling apart, when I felt completely alone in the world, I needed my father. I know, he said, his own tears falling freely now. I failed you when you needed me most, and I'll regret that until the day I die. We sat in silence for several minutes, both of us crying for different reasons. Dad was mourning the relationship he'd thrown away. I was grieving the father I'd lost twice, once to divorce and abandonment, and now to cancer. Finally, I pulled the chair closer to his bed and sat down. Tell me about these 8 years, I said. Tell me what happened to you after you left. What followed was the most honest conversation I'd ever had with my father. Dad's story was exactly what I'd expected, and somehow more tragic than I'd imagined. After leaving our family, he'd moved to Phoenix, chasing a job opportunity that turned out to be far less promising than advertised. He'd bounced from one city to another, one relationship to another, one job to another, never staying anywhere long enough to build a real life. I was running from my guilt, he explained, his voice weak but steady. Every time I started to settle somewhere, I'd remember what I'd done, and I'd convince myself I needed a fresh start somewhere else. The pattern had continued for years. He'd had a brief marriage in Denver that ended when his wife realized he was emotionally unavailable. He'd started a business in Seattle that failed because he couldn't focus on anything long enough to make it succeed. He'd developed a drinking problem that cost him several jobs and most of his savings. I kept telling myself I'd get my life together and then come find you, he said. But the more time passed, the more impossible it seemed. How do you explain to your daughter that you've been gone for 3 years, for 5 years, for 8 years? Mom's story, which she shared when I finally agreed to see her in the family waiting room, was similarly heartbreaking. Her marriage to Tony had lasted 2 years before he left her for someone younger. She'd struggled financially ever since, working a series of dead-end jobs and accumulating debt. I thought about you every single day, she said, clutching a tissue in her hands. I'd see girls your age at the store or the movies, and I'd wonder what you looked like, whether you were happy, if you hated me. I did hate you, I said honestly, for a long time. She nodded, accepting the truth of my words. I deserved that. I failed as a mother in every way that matters. What struck me most about both of their stories was how their decision to abandon me had poisoned the rest of their lives. They hadn't moved on to better, happier existences without me. Instead, they'd spent 8 years running from the consequences of their choices, never finding peace or genuine happiness. We know we can't undo what we did, Mom said, and we know you've built a wonderful life without us. Richard and Helena gave you everything we should have given you. They did, I agreed. They saved me. We're grateful for that, Dad said when I returned to his room. We're grateful that you had people who loved you the way you deserved to be loved. Over the next 3 weeks, I visited Dad almost daily, not because I'd forgiven him completely, but because I was finally getting to know the real person behind the father who had failed me. Facing death had stripped away his defenses and pretenses, revealing someone who was deeply flawed but genuinely remorseful. We talked about my childhood, about the good memories from before the divorce. We talked about Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena, and he listened with genuine interest as I described the life they'd given me. We even talked about my business and my plans for the future. "You became everything I hoped you'd become," he said during one of our last conversations. "You're strong, successful, independent, everything a father wants his daughter to be." "No thanks to you," I replied, but without the venom that statement would have carried weeks earlier. "No," he agreed. "Thanks to Richard and Helena, and thanks to your own strength." Dad died on a Tuesday morning in early spring, with Mom and me holding his hand. His last words were, "I love you, Holly. I always did." I helped Mom plan a simple funeral service. Dad had outlived most of his friends, and he'd burned bridges with many family members over the years. The mourners were mostly hospital staff who had grown fond of him during his final weeks. As we stood graveside watching Dad's casket being lowered into the ground, Mom turned to me with red-rimmed eyes. "I know you probably don't want a relationship with me," she said. "I know I don't deserve one, but I want you to know that I'm proud of the woman you've become, and I'm sorry I wasn't there to see you grow up." I looked at this woman who had given birth to me but had never really been my mother, and I felt something I hadn't expected. Compassion. "I'm not ready for a relationship," I said honestly, "but maybe we could start with occasional coffee." The smile that spread across her face was worth the small risk I was taking. 6 months later, as I sat in my office reviewing the quarterly reports that showed Uncle Richard's firm continuing to thrive under my leadership, I reflected on the unexpected turns my life had taken. My parents were flawed people who had made terrible choices, but they weren't the monsters I'd built them up to be in my mind. Forgiveness, I'd learned, wasn't about absolving them of their failures. It was about freeing myself from the burden of carrying their mistakes. Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena had given me the foundation of love and security I needed to become strong enough to forgive. They'd taught me that I was worthy of love, valuable enough to fight for, deserving of respect and care. With that foundation secure, I could afford to be generous with the parents who had failed me, because their opinion of me no longer defined my worth. I was Holly Montgomery, successful business owner, survivor, and finally a woman at peace with her past and excited about her future. And if you've made it this far in my story, if you've felt the pain of family betrayal or the joy of finding your chosen family, make sure to like and subscribe. Sometimes the most broken beginnings lead to the strongest endings. That's the truth Uncle Richard and Aunt Helena taught me, and it's a lesson worth sharing.